Hello internet, and today's video is going to be another book opinion, those videos in which I tell you my opinion on a book, and today's book is going to be My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Fredrick Backman. That is a really long title to say every single time. I, let it be known, really love all of this man's books. Like, I own all of them, I believe, or at least all of the ones that have been translated. I cannot wait to see more from this author. So this book follows along a young 7-year-old girl, and she has just gone through the death of her grandmother. So we meet her grandmother and her, and we kind of see their relationship, and then Elsa experiences what it is like to lose basically her best friend, and now she's kind of having to deal with this. Her grandmother leaves behind a letter to Elsa and says, hey, go around and pass out these letters to people of my path, just saying that I'm sorry for things. So this is a whole journey of Elsa going to different people that are in her large building, because they live in like a condominium sort of building, flat ownership thing, I don't know, like an apartment building, and she is supposed to go around and pass out these letters from her grandmother that basically apologize for something that her grandmother feels sorry for pertaining to this certain person. And by doing so, Elsa learns a lot more about the people who live around her and the history of her grandmother. I really like this story. It was interesting to see this perspective from a 7-year-old girl, especially a 7-year-old girl who I believe was very similar to me. She's very particular and sort of weird, and I loved everything. She's kind of snarky, and she's very much like her grandmother, which I really love. She also has a great love for books, especially Harry Potter and comic books, which I also really enjoy. So I love when she makes references to those things, or when someone's like, oh, that Harry Potter stuff, and she's like, what kind of muggle is this? Like, why don't people read quality literature and stuff like that? I just thought it brought a lot to her character of her being like this kind of sassy little imaginative girl who was really firm on what she loved, and her trying to figure out like the people around her and what all these letters from her grandmother meant. I think was an interesting way for her to deal with death, by her kind of like not wanting to accept it, but at the same time accepting it, and her trying to fulfill the last wishes of her grandmother as well. I really like how she explores the environment around her and gets to know these other people. There is also like an extra portion to this book that I think of as a bonus. A lot of this book is told through stories. So Elsa was introduced to this world, this imaginative world, by her grandmother, and her grandmother sort of made up this whole world called Meloria or something like that, and has been telling Elsa these stories all her life about different fairy tales and different worlds that exist in this imaginative world. So when Elsa is telling the story of like how she's going around giving these letters to all these different people, she is also recalling this world a lot that her and her grandmother shared, recalling stories that her grandmother has told her, and putting real life faces to these stories, because her grandmother was inspired a lot by the people around her when telling these fairy tales to Elsa. So Elsa is finally putting faces to these fairy tales and really learning how to deal with the fact that her grandmother was somebody other than just her grandmother as well. So I really like that exploration of her trying to reconcile this picture of her grandmother, of who she thought her grandmother is, and slowly learning more about the type of person her grandmother was when she wasn't being a grandma, and just slowly coming to full terms that she's not going to have her best friend around anymore, and she's going to have to build a community outside of her grandmother. And her grandmother from beyond the grave is sort of helping her with that by having her give away these letters to different people, and also slowly learning about the other people she lives around and sort of what makes them tick and what type of people they are, instead of Elsa being alone. It's like it's a very sweet story, because like you can tell like this grandmother really cares for her granddaughter, and she knows, hey, I'm not going to be here anymore, but I want to make sure my granddaughter still has somebody who looks out for her. And then this granddaughter just like really loving her grandmother and coming to understand her grandmother on a deeper level than she ever did before. So like in all of Fredrick Backman's books, that's not the full picture of the story. We do have a lot of other little subplots that have to do with other characters that we learn about in this book, because they have backstories and stuff like that. I really like this mix of that fairy tale world built in, and we kind of hearing a couple of fairy tales, and also really uses these fairy tales to kind of work as a allegory for things that are going on in real life. So if you've ever watched Stranger Things, and you know how those kids use Dungeons and Dragons to explain what they are seeing in real life, Elsa does the same sort of thing when it comes to different events that are happening in the course of this book. She'll explain them by using terms of this magical world that her grandmother introduced her to, and that's how she kind of handles the world and her explaining stuff. And you can see that she's still very much a kid, but she's a very smart kid, and she's very relatable. So you're not like lost with her mind and stuff. And it's such a glorious and adorable book, at the same time very heartwarming. I've mentioned it before, I really like books that explore like human emotion very well. So this is another book that deals sort of with death and grieving, but in a sort of happier, lighthearted way, because like I've mentioned before, people have different ways of grieving depending on the person, depending on who the person was, and like what kind of relationship it was. So I really emulated with this version and like this story a lot more than I have with others I've read. And I especially really love Elsa. Like, I like that she's just calling everyone out for not reading quality literature. I like that she has like her own little particulars about it. I like that she uses terms she's familiar with from these fairy tales that she's really attached to kind of explain the things that she's seeing in real life. So another comment I want to make is that if you are familiar with Fredrick Backman's books, you know there is another book that he wrote called Britt Marie Was Here. I'm going to recommend that if you're interested in that book and this author, read this book first, because Britt Marie is a character in this book, and this book sort of introduces her as a character, and kind of you get a frame of reference for when you read that book. So this is a part of a series, but not really. There are closer connections in this book and Britt Marie Was Here than in the other Fredrick Backman books that kind of stand on their own. So like Bear Town, A Man Called Uva, those are unrelated to this, but in this case, Britt Marie and this book exist in the same universe, so it is sort of more helpful to read this one than that one. I would highly recommend all of Fredrick Backman's books if you're really into contemporary, and even if you're not into contemporary, because personally I am not the hugest fan of contemporary, but Fredrick Backman has this like gift to really convey human emotions so well and make characters so fascinating that these mundane things of everyday life seem all the better, because you're really getting a feel for the people in his stories. So that just this idea of a girl going around and dropping off letters, like that's something that's pretty mundane, but by having these great characters and having these emotions from these characters, and having every character have like flaws and faults, but also really good things that you can love about them, and never going forth and saying that is a bad person and that is a bad person. He sort of lets you as the reader decide whether or not you're going to like a character, and whether or not you can stand a character. So it really like it's reminiscent to like real life for me, where I get a chance to fully form my own opinions on each character introduced in this book, because never once is he fully saying this person has only bad qualities and this person has only good qualities. So like it seems a little cliche to say he writes very realistic characters, but he does, and he makes them so interesting that, again, like I said, these mundane, like normal everyday things become fun, interesting things to look at, and really just it brings you a lot of joy, and it points out a lot of things you're just like, oh my gosh, like that's so true, or you can really relate to. Like, I think you could easily relate to about every single character that he writes about, the good and the bad. So I highly suggest his books. I highly suggest this book in particular because Elsa is such a doll. Like, she is amazing. I love that she runs around with her Gryffindor scarf all the time. I love that she references Harry Potter on occasions. I love that she talks about comic books. I don't think like this is like really heavy on those references, so if that is not something you're into, I'm not saying you wouldn't enjoy this book. I still think you can, but it's always interesting to have a character who is like a fangirl in one thing and really enjoys something, because like us as book lovers, I think we can really relate to that, having a character in our books who is also really involved with a book themselves and really invested in that. So it's always great to see a character who is like that. It's always just kind of really comforting, and it always makes me smile a little bit. So if you like what you're seeing here and you want to continue seeing more, click all those bunny buttons down below, and goodbye, internet.